Hi again, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for another edition of our podcast this week. First of all, I just want to say that I hope you are all doing well during this very uncertain time with COVID-19. And I do apologize if some of the audio is a little off, obviously, because of the social distancing recommendations. We are not doing this interview person to person, so I apologize in advance if any of the audio sounds a little shaky at any time during the podcast. But I do want to introduce all of you to today's guest analyst, Dominic Bordenaro. He is the former president of the Ball State Democrats. He served in that role for 2 years. He's the former vice president of the College Democrats of Indiana. He was the deputy campaign manager for Terry Whit Bailey, who is a former candidate for Muncie mayor, as well as having interned on several other political campaigns. So he's been very involved in the political field for many years now. So Dominic, thank you for joining me, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Cameron.
All right, so let's get into this topic that I've been kind of covering through these podcasts, the idea of the incumbency advantage within the media. Now, obviously, the notion of the incumbency advantage is nothing new. There are many ways in which sitting politicians have a leg up on anyone who attempts to unseat them in elections, whether it be a primary election or a general election. Now, what's far less commonly discussed, however, is whether the media may actually provide challengers with any kind of advantages of their own during elections. So I'm just going to turn it to you. Do you feel like this is a legitimate thing, that the media does at times provide advantages to challengers in elections, or is there simply not enough evidence to back that up?
I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to say it depends on the scenario. I think if you're looking at candidates specifically, the answer is maybe. Where I see the media really providing an advantage to the challenger isn't necessarily with the person, but it's with the party. So let's look at the presidential race. If not this current one, but let's say a Republican has been in office for 2 terms, and so his term is up, and so now there's a new Republican candidate and a Democrat candidate. I think the media is going to provide advantages to the challenger, the Democrat candidate. I think, we've seen in the past, usually the presiding party loses after 2 terms. Often because the American people, quote unquote, want change.
Right.
I think the media is what fuels that want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a very interesting take on it, and I think that's something that, like you said, historically does hold up without question. I mean, there, with few exceptions, especially over the last, going on 30 years now, that's really been the way that things have been shaping up. So yeah, that does make sense. So in situations where there is an incumbent, you feel like the media doesn't play as big of a role?
They may. I don't know that there's enough evidence to back it up.
Sure.
But I think the incumbent has so much other advantages that even if the media did provide that advantage, it wouldn't necessarily be enough.
Sure. Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. We didn't discuss that in our last episode, so that's definitely worth noting. Okay, so we've talked about the general idea, so let's get into a couple of specifics here. Now, a 1987 article from the journal Legislative Studies Quarterly titled Mass Media in Congressional Elections. This journal makes the assertion that the incumbency advantage within the media is more prevalent in House races than in Senate races. Now, this was over 30 years ago that this was published, obviously, so a lot's changed. But do you feel like that assertion, that the media provides more of an advantage to an incumbent in House races than in Senate races, do you feel like that is something that may still hold true today?
I don't know, and I'm going to give this another maybe. My first thought is Senate races are statewide. Now, when it comes to media, there is no statewide media, if that makes sense.
Sure.
There's no CNN for the state of Indiana.
Right.
We just have our local newspapers, our local news stations. You could argue the Indianapolis Star is a state newspaper. I would say it's not. So if there is an advantage, I think it's going to go more to your House races, because those are, smaller races compared to the Senate race. So I could buy the argument. I just don't know if, with the dying of TV news and newspapers, and the prevalence of social media advertising, I don't know if it would still hold true today.
No, definitely. Yeah. No, I think that's another fair point. And I think that's something, too, that we discussed when I had Dr. Wade on, is the fact that Senate races are statewide. And so you do have more of a statewide awareness of what's happening with that race. And so then that can affect people's attention that's given to it, versus in a House race where you may not even know who the incumbent is, but if they're the incumbent, you tend to just vote for them. That's how this data stacks up according to this article. But again, 30 years has gone by since that was published. A lot may have changed, but definitely good commentary on that as well. Okay, now that question highlights the potential differences between the two chambers of Congress when it comes to the incumbency advantage. So now let's talk about two positions that are elected by the same populations of people, and that's senators and governors. Now, a 1994 article from the journal Political Research Quarterly titled Gubernatorial and Senatorial Elections says this: from 1980 to 1992, only 11% of lowest profile challengers running against Senate incumbents were successful, while 24% of such challengers in gubernatorial contests won. So we got a 13-point difference there between the Senate challenger and the gubernatorial challenger. Now, they attribute this to the higher levels of media coverage on governors as opposed to senators, thus allowing people to form stronger opinions about them and be willing to vote them out of office because they are more informed about the job that their governor is doing versus their senator. Now, again, it's been a while since this was published. So do you feel like that is a fair assessment of why we might be seeing that 13-point difference in the success rate of challengers against incumbents?
I'm inclined to say yes. I'm pushing towards I feel like that is a fair assessment. If you look at states that are predominantly Republican or predominantly Democrat, there are more that will have, if it's a red state, that would have a Democrat governor than a Democrat senator. Maryland, which is a very blue state, has a Republican governor.
Right.
I think gubernatorial elections can be really competitive, and I think that is because of the increased media coverage on governors. Look at even throughout a governor's career. Look at Indiana right now, going through the COVID-19 epidemic that we're having. The media is focused on Governor Holcomb. No one is talking about Senator Braun or Senator Young, the two Republican senators.
That's a good point.
Indiana. Yeah. The attention is all on the governor. A governor is basically, either the mayor or the president of the state.
Right.
And so I'm inclined to agree with that. I think the media plays a large role in the more competitive nature of governor races.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think particularly with this year's upcoming election, it will be very interesting to see how this entire situation that we're dealing with right now, how the media uses that and these governors' responses and the president's response to this situation to either help them or potentially be of a detriment to them when we get closer to these general elections. So yeah, I completely agree. That's a great point, that in a moment like this, you're not hearing from Senator Braun, you're not hearing from Senator Young, you are hearing from Governor Holcomb every day at 2:30 on the air. He is the one that you see his face. So yeah, that's a great point, and I think that'll be very telling to see how that all plays out come November or whenever we do end up having these general elections. Okay, now let's move on then to talk about one of the media's biggest impacts on election cycles, and that is selling advertising opportunities to candidates. Now, when I was talking to Dr. Waite back in February, all of the talk at that point was about Mike Bloomberg, and the guy was spending hundreds of millions of dollars on campaign ads, and for a while it was kind of keeping him, I'm not going to say it was keeping him at the front, but it was keeping him afloat amongst the pack of candidates there. That's a prime example, in my opinion, about how somebody who got in a race, was only in it for 2.5 months, and was suddenly able to propel himself towards the front, not to the top, but towards the front, simply because of these campaign ads that the media allows you to buy. And now, a 2003 article from the journal State Politics and Policy Quarterly, titled "Not All Money is Equal: The Differential Effect of Spending by Incumbents and Challengers in Gubernatorial Primaries," found that campaign spending for challengers in these situations can help tremendously when they're trying to bolster name recognition and discuss their positions on different issues. So, do you feel like that is actually the case? And do you feel like that same thing may actually take place in other elections? Now, I know this year, like we just said, is going to be a lot different than a normal election year, just given the circumstances. But do you feel like, in general, the media can provide that assistance for challengers simply to get their name out there?
Yeah, I do. And you specifically look at Mike Bloomberg and how much money he spent on advertising. Talk to anybody that has watched YouTube over the past few months, before he dropped out, and ask them what the most watched ad they think it was. And I guarantee they're going to say Mike Bloomberg. Or if you ask them if they know who Mike Bloomberg is, they're going to say yes, even if they didn't before, because he just poured money into YouTube and Facebook and those different things. You couldn't really get on YouTube without seeing a Mike Bloomberg ad.
Right.
It's somewhere like 95% of elections are won by the candidate that spends the most money. Now, that's not always true. Mike Bloomberg dropped out. He spent the most money. But I think another thing we also have to look at, and a big critique I have about polling, is I argue that national polling is not really relevant in either the primary or the national election. The primary, because we do primaries state by state, and the national election, or the general election, because we have the Electoral College. So, during the primary, things change constantly based off of, how somebody does in this state or the other. So someone could be polling in 5th place, 6th place nationally and spend, millions of dollars in one state and win that state and then start winning states after that. In the general election, we saw this with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary was blowing Donald Trump out of the water in national polls. But at the end of the day, the only states that mattered were those swing states that she lost. So I think the media, when it comes to name recognition, yes, I don't know if it helps promote their positions on different issues. I think when you look at political advertising, to answer the second part of the question there, they don't necessarily focus as much on issues. It's more of like general topics, if that makes sense. There's no specific policy.
No, definitely. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too, because you're right. I mean, the guy who spends the most money is going to be the one who naturally has a lot of success because you can get your name out there more. Every other commercial, it seemed like, for a month and a half was a Mike Bloomberg commercial. And now, of course, this, at the same time, while he did have short-term success, that kind of negates it by the fact that he wasn't able to do well when he needed to do well. And so,
exactly.
Yeah.
And to add on that, we don't really know. He might have done well if all the other moderates had not dropped out and endorsed Biden before Super Tuesday like they did. So we really don't know the answer to that. I think that might have had some effect on how he did, but I still didn't think he would win a state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's fair too, because a lot of things in that moment were changing pretty quickly, and so yeah, that's a very good way of looking at it as well. I am curious if, let's say, a year from now, we have a Democrat in the White House. I mean, this is, every 4 years, this is the ultimate case of whether a challenger, well, not every 4 years, but if you have a sitting president who's running for re-election and you have a challenger running against them, that's the ultimate case of, well, okay, do they have a fighting chance? So my question is, if we have a Democrat sitting in the White House a year from now, whether it be Bernie, whether it be Joe Biden, do you feel like the media will have played a substantial role in making that happen?
Can you repeat that for me? I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. Basically, if we have a Democrat who's able to defeat Donald Trump in November, how much do you feel the media will have played a role in that Democratic challenger beating the Republican incumbent?
Okay. I don't know, and that'll be interesting to see what happens, because I believe that in 2016 the media did a great job pushing Donald Trump. Not pushing, probably poor choice of words, but he was the entertainment candidate. He was easy to cover. He was always saying something controversial. There was always a reason to be talking about him on the news, and I think that's what really pushed him. I'm going to answer this question under the assumption that Joe Biden's going to win the nomination, because
Sure.
That's how it looks, is what's going to happen. I think Joe Biden is he's a good candidate. I think he's a boring candidate. It'll be interesting to see if Donald Trump continues with his controversial statements that he often made in 2016 that he doesn't make as often anymore. Things that really grabbed media attention for him. I think, I think this is such a unique time that we're in that it's really hard for me to answer that question just, blankly.
Sure,
So.
absolutely. No, and I think the point you just made, too, is key, because that was one of the things, whether he was doing it intentionally or not, that was one of the things that really did keep him in the spotlight, were his statements that were so outlandish, especially for somebody running for president, that the media would latch onto those, be discussing them regularly, and then the next thing you know, you're not hearing about other candidates. So yeah, I think that's a fair point. It will be interesting to see how much of that actually takes place this time around, and whether his Democratic challenger is able to see that coming and try to shift the media attention to his benefit. It will be interesting to see how that all plays out for sure. All right.
And to throw this in there too, I am, as I'm Democrat. I'm former president of all state college Democrats. Vice president of college Democrats of Indiana. The Democrat Party has done a terrible job at controlling the narrative in the media. The last time the Democrat Party beat the Republican Party in that was in 2008 when Obama was running for election, his first time around. I'd even argue in 2012 we were trumped by the Republican Party in 2012 when it came to controlling the narrative in the media. And with that was the Tea Party wave of 2010. But so it will be interesting to see if the DNC and Joe Biden's campaign can come up with any kind of new tactics or anything to take a hold of that narrative. Because if we can't do that, we don't win.
Very interesting take for sure. Yeah, that is a fair point. Talking about how much the candidate has the ability to control that narrative and how much the media just creates the narrative and then plays off of that on their own accord. It is going to be interesting to see, and we're getting closer to that by the day. Now, I do want to just bring one more thing before we go, and this is something that is much more recent than a lot of the articles that I have referenced, because a lot of that information, it is fairly dated, with the most recent of the three that I've referenced being published nearly 20 years ago. Now, as our society has shifted to be very focused on social media, do you feel like there are ways in which challengers might have advantages in that realm as well? And one instance that comes to mind for me particularly is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's massive upset over the 20-year incumbent Congressman Joe Crowley in 2018. She built a massive following through social media, and she rode that support all the way to Capitol Hill. So do you think this kind of media exposure leading to incumbent losses could potentially become commonplace in the future?
Yeah, possibly. And I love Ocasio-Cortez, but, you know, I never even heard of her until she beat Congressman Crowley in 2018. Never even heard of her. Didn't know about her campaign leading up to that. And so while she was, and I'm going to kind of blow the argument a little bit, while she was starting to build her social media following and everything, she also just had a great base of volunteers in her districts that were out knocking doors every day. She was out knocking doors every day. And really, Congressman Crowley really just became complicit in winning. 20-year incumbent, his last few cycles probably didn't even really campaign. And all of a sudden, here comes this young, energetic, strong woman with new ideas, who is amassing volunteers and a social media following and a fundraising base that outworked him. And because she outworked him, she won. And I'm a strong believer, if you outwork your opponent, you will win. And so, yes and no. I think it just all really depends on the election. I think it works more with national elections than it does with congressional elections. I think, back to before Super Tuesday with Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, all the moderates, or most of the moderates, dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden, right? So the next day, most of these states voting on Super Tuesday, Joe Biden he might have had one campaign office in those states. There were some states he didn't have a campaign office in. He wasn't spending money. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders had volunteers out knocking doors every day. He had multiple offices in most of these states, paid staffers on the ground, and he lost. And so I think that has something to say about what kind of impact social media has in 2020. What kind of, does groundwork matter if you don't have the media narrative? If your social media, if social media is not trending your way, will it matter at the end of the day? What kind of voters are going to turn out? I think those are all questions that are too soon to answer. I think we need a couple more election cycles through to see exactly what's happening with that. But like I said, I think it's starting to trend that way nationally. I'm not seeing it at a congressional level.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that's true too about Biden and Sanders, how that's all been working. I mean, Biden, in the media's eyes, as far as the media was portraying it, whenever there was a notion that Biden was going to potentially start a campaign for 2020, the media put him at the top of the list of candidates. That was how it was working at first. And so I did find it interesting initially when he wasn't having success in the early states, how the media narrative immediately flipped and said, well, this is the end for Joe Biden. I mean, clearly America has spoken. He's done. And then as soon as we get to Super Tuesday and we see that he is winning multiple states, well, then the media, the narrative changes again. And so I do think it's interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, I really do think it's interesting how that narrative can shift so much. And the question, like you say, is how much does that ultimately impact the result? Because Bernie Sanders, at least in the last election, and certainly it feels again in this election, has a large backing of younger people. which are the ones who primarily are using social media. And so it will be interesting to see. Of course, like you said, it appears that it's going to be Joe Biden as the candidate at this point, but going into the general and then moving forward in the next few years or so, just seeing how much social media and how much the media really does impact these elections. It's no secret, I don't think, that a lot of people within the media, because of how Donald Trump has interacted with them, aren't the biggest fans of him. And so it is going to be interesting once we get to a point where we have the two candidates set for November to see what ends up happening. Dominic Bordenaro, once again, he is the former vice president of All State Democrats, the former president of All State Democrats. Let me make sure I get that right. The former vice president of the College Democrats of Indiana. He's been our guest analyst today. Dominic, anything to say before I let you go?
Just make sure you are registered to vote.
There we go. Absolutely. And that I'm curious on a personal note. Has that registration deadline been extended because the state's election day has been extended?
Yes, and I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but it is in May.
Okay.
I also strongly encourage everyone to request an absentee ballot. And you can print that form off online and mail that to your county clerk's office. They've moved it so that anyone can vote absentee. You do not have to have an excuse.
Very good to know. Yeah, I hope our listeners are definitely taking note of that for sure. All right, Dominic, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank all of you for listening. I do appreciate the time that you've taken, and I hope you all stay well and be safe and stay indoors if you can. All right, take care.